It all started with the sound of sirens. Red and blue lights flashed across the wide open fields of South Ridge Ranch, kicking up dust as two sheriff cruisers rolled up the gravel. Driveway Hank Lawson, a tall man with worn boots, a sun-cracked hat, and hands tougher than leather, stood calmly beside his fence. His shirt was streaked with dirt and sweat, and his old sheepdog Rusty wagged his tail, slowly sensing something was off. Hank was unsurprised to see the sheriff's cars. What surprised him was the shrill, smug voice that followed that S. Him, that S. The man I told you about, he. S breaking every HOA rule in the book. It was her, Karen Bellamy, the woman who lived at the edge of the subdivision. That bordered Hank's ranch, the woman who just months ago had been elected president of the Homeowners Association. Even though she only lived there for a year, she was known for her perfectly trimmed lawn, her loud opinions, and her obsession with everything being up to code. The sheriff stepped out, hand resting casually on his belt. "Mr. Lawson, we got a call about some kind of disturbance livestock, too close to the neighborhood violation of ordinances." "Trespassing reports," Karen interrupted, stepping forward in her designer sunglasses, holding up her phone, as if it were a badge of authority. "I've got video evidence. He's allowing his cows to wander near our homes. One of them got FT from my gardenia bush. That is a clear threat. I want him cited or arrested." Hank raised an eyebrow, silent for a moment. Then he said, slow and steady, "Sheriff, you might want to check her facts, 'cause if you're about to arrest me on my own land, well, we're going to have a real interesting day." The sheriff exchanged a look with his deputy. Something wasn't adding up. And what Karen didn't know, what she was about to learn the hard way, was that she had just made a huge mistake. But before anything else could be said, one of the cows let out a loud moo, followed by a scream from one of Karen's friends who had tagged along for the confrontation. The cow had done something that would change the tone of the entire day. And that was when things really blew up a few weeks earlier. Hank had been living a quiet life. He was a fourth-generation rancher. His family had owned South Ridge Ranch since the earliest. They raised cattle, grew hay, and lived simply. His granddad always said, "If your boots are dirty and your heart is clean, you're redoing just fine." Hank lived by that. The subdivision next door had only popped up in the last years. A bunch of luxury homes had been built on what used to be grazing fields, and slowly the quiet, dusty area started getting manicured lawns, backyard pools, and neighborhood meetings. At first, Hank didn't mind. People were allowed to live how they wanted. Some of the neighbors were kind, like Bill from Lot, who brought Hank warm apple pie after branding season, or Linda, who let her grandkids pet Hank scoats through the fence. But then Karen moved in. It began small, a letter in his mailbox from the HOA about the unsightly barn roof. Hank did, and even live in the subdivision. His land was adjacent, but Karen had taken it upon herself to beautify the community, and in her eyes, Hank's ranch was an eyesore. Next came the fence complaints, then the noise complaints. Then the time she stood at the property line with a notepad scribbling down times and dates every time Hank's tractor made noise one day. Hank found a little sign stuck into the dirt by his fence warning, "Ranch activity disturbs community peace." He took the sign down, shook his head, and tossed it into his tool shed. But the final straw came the morning Rusty wandered into the edge of the subdivision, still on Hank's land, mind you, but just close enough to sniff. Karen Scarden gnome, she screamed like he was a wolf, "I am calling the HOA." And the police, Rusty, who hadn't chased anything faster than a butterfly in years, just tilted his head in confusion. From then on, Hank tried to stay even further away from the subdivision fence line. He put up extra signs, added more fencing, but then his cows started getting spooked. He found bits of trash candy wrappers and plastic bags in his pasture, and once even a bottle of weed killer tossed over the fence. That's when he installed cameras, not to spy, just to know. And what he saw late one night chilled him to the bone. Karen climbing halfway over his fence, dumping something from a bag. He did, and confront her not yet. Was still thinking about the best way to handle it without making things worse. Hank always believed in kindness, in understanding people. His mother taught him to never swing first, only defend. And he wanted to believe. Maybe Karen was just stressed. Maybe life hadn't been kind to her lately. But kindness has its limits. And that morning with the police, that was when the line was crossed. Because Karen had stepped far beyond her reach, she had made it official, and she was about to regret it. The sheriff bent down to inspect the ground near the fence line. Karen kept going on louder now, talking about property values and livestock diseases and HOA bylaws, but the sheriff didn't seem interested in her words. He was staring at something in the dirt, Karen noticed, and marched over. Is there a problem, officer? The sheriff stood up slowly. Karen, this is cow manure. Karen made a face exactly on the edge of my property, actually. He pointed. Your property line ends. FT back. This here's still part of Mr. Lawson's ranch. She blinked. But the cows were near our land, the deputy chimed in, being near his aunt. A crime, ma'am. Karen's voice sharpened. Then, what about the fence? It's crooked, and that dog, it came too close to me. Rusty wagged his tail. The sheriff turned to Hank. You said you had cameras installed. Hank nodded. Got footage going back a month. Karen froze now for the first time. Her confidence seemed to crack. Just a little. Her sunglasses slid down her nose, revealing darting eyes. What does that have to do with anything? She asked a bit too quickly. The sheriff looked at Hank again. Mind if we take a look? Hank nodded once, not at all. He led them toward the barn where the old monitor system was set up on a wooden table. Rusty trotted behind them. Karen followed to her arms. Crossed jawed tight, but just before they reached the barn, one of Hank's cows let out that strange moo. Again, the one that had made Karen's friends scream earlier. Hank turned sharply. Something wasn't right. Then came the crash, a loud splintering thud from behind the hay bales. Everyone froze. The sheriff drew his weapon. Stay back, Karen gasped. Rusty barked once, then bolted around the side of the barn. There was someone back there, and just like that, the situation flipped from a silly HOA squabble to something much, much bigger. The air shifted, the kind of shift you feel in your bones before a storm hits. The sheriff's boots crunched over the gravel as he moved quickly toward the barn's far side. Hands still on his holster, the deputy followed, eyes scanning alert. Karen hesitated, torn between following and fleeing, her eyes wide, now not with anger but with fear. Hank didn't run. He walked calm but steady past the hay bales stacked to the rafters. He'd been on this land all his life. There wasn't a square inch of it he didn't know like the back of his hand, but even he didn't expect what he saw next. Behind the barn, tangled in a mess of tarp and splintered fence, Wood was a teenager, not one. Hank recognized the kid, looked up, startled. His jeans were muddy, and one arm was scratched and bleeding from where he'd fallen through the broken part of the fence he'd been trying to run and failed. What in the world? Hank muttered. The sheriff lowered his hand from his gun, realizing this wasn't a threat, at least not in the way they'd feared. You okay, son? The sheriff asked. The boy looked like a deer in headlights, breathing fast. I wasn't stealing nothing, I swear. I was just trying to find a place to sleep, that's all. Karen finally caught up and peeked around the barn wall, shrieking when she saw the boy. That's who was back here. Or a vagrant, I knew it. Probably hopped off a train or something. He could be dangerous. Hank took a step forward, ignoring Karen. What's your name, son? The kid hesitated, then mumbled, Jake. You hungry, Jake? The boy blinked. What, you hungry, Hank? Repeated the kid, nodded slowly. Yeah. I ain't eaten since yesterday morning, Karen scoffed. You're seriously feeding him. He's trespassing. He could have diseases. The sheriff held up a hand to quiet her, then looked back at Hank. You want to press charges, Hank? Looked at the boy, scared, dirty, not much older than no. Hank said simply, I want to get him cleaned up and fed. Karen gasped so hard she nearly choked on her own words. You can't be serious. You're just going to let him stay here. What if he tries to rob you in your sleep? He ain't a threat, Hank said quietly. He's just a kid. The deputy took a slow breath, his eyes softening. We'll need to call child services. Make sure he's safe. Jake's face went pale. Please, no. Don't send me back. I'll run again, I swear. I will. The sheriff frowned back from where the boy bit his lip. Foster care. They don't treat us good. There I was better on the streets. Karen looked like she was about to explode. This is turning into a circus, my HOA. Doesn't allow livestock to wander, and it sure doesn't allow runaway vagrants camping next door. This is a crime scene, but no one was listening to her anymore. Hank knelt beside Jake and offered a hand. The boy looked at it for a long moment before finally taking it. Come on. Rusty will show you where the kitchen is. Got some stew left from lunch. Jake followed Hank slowly. Rusty trotted along like he was welcoming family. Karen stood frozen in place, jaw-locked, arms trembling in disbelief. She looked at the sheriff. Well, aren't you going to do something? He sighed. We'll make a report, ma'am, but this is private land, and last I checked, Mr. Lawson hasn't broken any laws. Karen's face turned red. This isn't over, the sheriff looked back at her. No, ma'am, I don't think. It is back in the ranch house kitchen. Hank set a steaming bowl of stew in front of Jake. The kid stared at it like it was made of gold. You don't gotta do this. Jake said, his voice low. I know. Hank replied, but someone's gotta show you not. Everyone out there's out to hurt you. Jake took the first bite and closed his eyes like he hadn't tasted warmth in weeks. You've been out there long? Hank asked. Jake nodded between bites. Almost a year. Bounced around homes before that. None of them wanted me after I turned. Hank leaned back in his chair, watching the boy. You got any family not that wants me? Rusty laid his head in Jake's lap. The boy flinched, then slowly scratched behind his ears. Hank smiled faintly. Looks like you got a friend already. Jake looked at the dog, then back at Hank. You're not scared I'll steal or wreck something? Hank shook his head. You had a dozen chances to run when you saw the sheriffs. You didn't? That tells me something. Outside the window. Karen was pacing near the fence line, barking into her phone. She's going to keep coming, isn't she? Jake asked. Yep, Hank said. Jake's eyes flicked to the window. Why does she hate you so much? Hank chuckled. Wish I knew. Maybe because I don't let her boss me around. Or maybe because I remind her the world's not always neat and tidy. Just then the back door creaked open. The sheriff stepped in. I need a word, Hank. They stepped outside, leaving Jake with Rusty. She's filing an official complaint, the sheriff said once. Zoning laws checked. Safety inspections. Wants to push through an emergency way vote to put pressure on you through county channels. Hank didn't look surprised. Let her, she's serious. This time, the sheriff warned, in Rich, she's got friends in high places. Money don't change what's right, Hank said. Let 'em come, but deep inside. Hank knew this was going to get worse before it got better. The next morning, the first hit came. The county sent an inspector, an official man in a stiff tie and shiny shoes, standing awkwardly on the ranch soil. I have an order to inspect all structures on this property for code violations. Karen stood just behind him, arms folded smugly, already taking pictures with her phone. Jake stood near the barn, nervous. Hank gave him a calm nod. They led the man around, showing him everything. Clean stables, it's a strong fencing, a safe storage of feed and tools. But then they got to the hayloft. The inspector looked up at the rafters, pulled out a notepad, and sighed. This structure is out of compliance with updated wind resistance regulations. It'll need to be retrofitted or torn down. Karen's smile widened. Like a snake, you hear that? Hank looks like the charming old barn is coming down. Hank kept his face still. How long do I have to comply? The inspector hesitated. Technically days. Karen's laughter was like nails on a chalkboard. TikTok rancher. Jake looked at Hank. What are you going to do? Hank looked up at the barn. His granddad had built it with his own 2 hands. That barn had stood through storms, droughts, even a tornado once. I'm going to fix it, Hank said. Karen blinked. Excuse me, I'm going to bring it up to code. Every nail, every beam. That'll cost a fortune, she snapped. I've got tools, I've got time, and I've got help, he said, clapping Jake on the back. Right? Jake nodded. Right. Karen's smile fell for the first time, and that's when Hank leaned closer to her and said quietly, You came to burn me down, Karen, but all you did was give me a reason to build. Karen stood there, stunned, as Hank and Jake turned back toward the barn, already talking about what supplies they'd need. But behind them, just out of earshot, the inspector picked up his phone and whispered into it. Yeah, you were right. The kid's here. Looks like he's staying. Pause. No, he doesn't know yet. Pause. I'll handle it. And with that, something darker began to unfold. The sky was the color of rust by the time the inspector drove off. Dust hung in the air like it had something to say, but no one was listening back at the barn. Hank was already sketching plans on an old wooden table, pencil behind one ear and sleeves rolled up. Jake stood across from him, holding a measuring tape in one hand and a hammer in the other. He looked unsure, like a kid who'd been handed responsibility for the first time and didn't quite know how to wear it. You sure you trust me with this? Jake asked. Hank didn't even look up. You held that fence together yesterday when the wind kicked up. That's enough for me. Jake cracked a smile. Wasn't much, just wedged a board in place. Sometimes the small things keep big things standing. Hank said. Jake didn't reply, but he stood a little straighter. For the next few hours they worked in a rhythm that didn't need Word's hammer saw a measure lift. Rusty laid in the shade, tail thumping now and then, for the first time in a long time. The ranch felt like a home again, not just for Hank, but for someone else too. But the peace didn't last. The next morning, a black SUV rolled up the dirt road, sleek, polished, out of place. Jake was in the barn loft, tightening new bolts into the rafters. When he heard voices, he peeked out the loft window. Karen was there, of course, standing beside the SUV like she'd summoned it from her front yard, but next to her stood a woman in a gray pantsuit, heels sinking into the gravel, holding a thick folder. Jake squinted. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw the way Karen pointed straight toward the barn. He felt cold all over. He knew that look. He'd seen it too many times. Panic snapped through him. He climbed down from the loft, grabbed his backpack from the workbench, and started for the fence line, but Rusty barked loud. Hank came out of the house, wiping his hands on a rag. Jake froze. The woman in the pantsuit turned, her eyes locked on him. She said something to Karen, then started walking fast in Jake's direction. Jake bolted. He didn't think, just ran. Hank shouted his name, but the boy didn't stop. He sprinted past the stables, past the feed shed, and straight for the far pasture where the tree line could swallow him whole if he made it there. But the woman was faster than she looked. She didn't chase him, but she reached the fence, pulled out a badge, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Jacob Myers, under state order. You are to be taken back into foster care custody immediately." Jake stumbled. Hank walked toward the fence, eyes narrowed. "You want to explain why you're showing up on my land without so much?" As a phone call, Karen stepped forward, all smug and shiny. "He's a runaway, and he's underage. Keeping him here is illegal." "That's harboring a minor, I told you, Sheriff. This man is dangerous." The woman didn't take her eyes off Hank. "I'm Agent Madison Kruger, child Protective Services, and according to my report, Jacob Myers has been missing for over months. If he's been here the whole time, he hasn't." Hank cut in. "He showed up just days ago, and he ain't been hurt. He's safe. You're welcome to talk to him, but you're not talking him without a court order. That's not your call to make, Mr. Lawson." Hank folded his arms. "The hell it ain't." Karen gaped. "He just admitted to breaking the law." "No," Hank said calmly. "I admitted to being kind." Jake had stopped running. He stood at the edge of the pasture, breathing hard, fists clenched, watching everything unfold. Agent Kruger sighed, looked at Jake, then back at Hank. "If the boy refuses to cooperate, I'll be forced to involve the sheriff's office." Hank didn't. "I'll blink. Then you'd best do that, because I ain't about to stand here and watch you drag a kid back to a system that's already failed him." Karen scoffed. "Oh, please, that's exactly the kind of bleeding heart nonsense that got you into this mess." "No, ma'am," Hank said. "What got me into this mess is you, and that's when something very unexpected happened." Jake turned around and started walking back toward the barn, straight toward the people trying to take him. Hank's chest tightened. "Jake, you don't have to," but Jake shook his head. "It's okay, Hank." He stopped in front of Agent Kruger. His voice was quiet but steady. "If I go back, I want to be placed somewhere that doesn't feel like a prison, somewhere with people who don't just shove food at me and lock me in a room." Kruger looked surprised. "That's not typical foster care policy." "I know what typical is," Jake said. "I lived it. So if I got to go back, it better be different this time." Kruger didn't speak for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Slowly we can talk, but you need to come with me." "Just for now." Jake looked back at Hank. Hank gave the smallest nod. Rusty wed as Jake walked toward the SUV, climbed in, and shut the door. Karen was beaming. "Well, that's one problem solved." But Hank wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the woman in the pantsuit and the way she looked back at Jake in the mirror. Cold, calculating, like she was checking off a box. And suddenly, Hank had a feeling this wasn't over, not even close. That night, the barn was quiet. The hammering had stopped, the laughter between Jake and Rusty gone. Hank sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, gone cold, staring out across the pasture. He knew he should feel proud. He'd helped the boy, protected him, gave him food, work, and dignity. But all he felt was the silence. Then the phone rang. He picked it up, expecting it to be the sheriff, but the voice on the other end wasn't who he expected it was. "Bill, the neighbor from Lot." "Hank, you might want to come out front. There's something happening." Hank stood, walked out to the fence, and stopped in his tracks. Crowd had gathered, not angry, not yelling, just neighbors from the subdivision. "Bill, Linda, a few others. They were carrying toolboxes, paint cans with planks. Hank raised an eyebrow. What's all this, Bill? Smiled. Heard you got 2 weeks to fix that barn. Linda held up a drill. Figured we'd help. Jake's not the only one you've helped over the years. Another man stepped forward. You've been hauling hay for my dad since his back went out. We ain't forgot. Karen stepped out from behind her porch light, stunned. You're helping him after everything? Linda turned toward her. Yes, Karen, because Hank helps people. That's what good neighbors do. Karen's jaw fell open, and for once she didn't have a single word to say. Hank looked at the crowd, at the tools, at the people standing up for him, for Jake, for what was right, and in that moment he realized something big. This wasn't just about a barn. This was about something deeper. But then a truck pulled up fast, too fast. The sheriff climbed out. Face tight, he marched straight toward Hank. We got a problem. What kind of problem? The sheriff looked Hank dead in the eye. Jake's gone missing. The words "Jake's gone missing" slammed into Hank like a kick to the gut. What do you mean gone? He asked, stepping forward fast. He was in state custody. They took him. The sheriff nodded. Grimly, he was, but he never made it to the center in Preston. That's where Agent Kruger was supposed to bring him, but he never checked in. A silence fell over the small group of neighbors behind Hank. What are you saying? Hank asked, his voice low. I'm saying that the agent who picked him up wasn't with CPS. We don't know who she was. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the sky. Karen's porch light flickered. Hank's mind raced. The badge, the paperwork, the SUV, everything had looked legit. You telling me she was fake? He asked. Slowly the sheriff nodded. Looks that way. Someone in the crowd gasped. Linda put a hand over her mouth. Karen stepped forward, frowning. That's ridiculous. I called her. I found her through the HOA legal forum. She had credentials, which she likely forged. The sheriff said. We pulled records from the state. There is no Agent Madison Kruger and no transfer order for Jake Myers. Hank turned his face to the stars, jaw clenched, rage like fire rising in his chest. Karen kept protesting, eyes wide, voice shaking. I didn't know. I thought I was helping. I thought she said she could move things faster. Congratulations. Hank snapped, his voice hard. For the first time, you just handed over a runaway kid to a stranger pretending to be the law. I didn't mean. I don't care what you meant. He roared. Karen stumbled back as if she'd been slapped. She'd seen Hank. I'm kind, even amused, but never this. The sheriff stepped in. We're tracking the vehicle at headplates. We've put out alerts across the state, but this is serious, Hank. Whoever took Jake, they planned it. How Hank asked, his throat dry. According to some of the security cam footage near the edge of the ranch, the SUV showed up days before Kruger came onto your land. They were watching, Hank said, eyes narrowing. The sheriff nodded and waiting. Karen's face was pale. But why would someone do that? He's just a kid. Hank looked at her. Because some people see kids like Jake as disposable. He's got no family, no records worth digging into. No one that would miss him but you would, Bill added, stepping beside Hank. We all would, said Linda. Karen looked around. Her confidence was crumbling like dry paper. I didn't mean no. Hank cut her off. You never mean it, Karen, but that's the thing. You never think past your own front yard. You never ask what people need. You just bark orders and call it helping. You don't see people, you see problems. Karen blinked, stunned. Hank turned to the sheriff. What do you need from me? I need everything you got, the sheriff said. Footage. Notes that boy's full name, and I need you to tell me if you think he'd try to run again. He wouldn't, Hank said without hesitation. Not unless he thought someone else was in danger. Then something clicked. Hank's eyes widened. Rusty. What about Rusty? The sheriff asked. He followed Jake to the fence when Kruger took him. That dog don't let people go easy. If Jake escaped, if he got away, he wouldn't come back to the house. Where would he go? Hank didn't even pause. The canyon. Minutes later, Hank was tearing across the back fields on his ATV. Rusty riding shotgun in the bed. The sheriff's cruiser followed behind, headlights bouncing with every dip. The canyon lay a few miles east, an old dry riverbed with jagged cliffs and an old hunting shack Hank hadn't used in years. It was where he taught Jake to spot deer trails, where they'd watch the stars just a few nights. Time to go. Rusty barked suddenly. Hank hit the brakes, slid through a patch of dry dirt, and shined his flashlight toward the edge of the canyon. There at the bottom of a steep slope, a backpack and drag marks in the dirt. Jake, Hank yelled, already halfway down the hill. Rusty leapt down ahead of him, scrambling across the rocks. Jake, no answer, then a cough, weak, dry, and then A voice, Hank ran faster. He found Jake wedged beneath a fallen tree limb, his arm cut badly and leg twisted at a wrong angle. His face was scratched, but his eyes were still sharp. "Don't you ever do that again," Hank said, crouching beside him. Jake managed a crooked smile. "Didn't think anyone come? You got more people looking for you than you know?" Hank said, pulling off his jacket and wrapping it around the boy's shoulders. Rusty licked Jake's face, whining. "How'd you get away?" Hank asked. Voice soft, Jake grimaced. "She got a phone call, turned around for a second. I opened the door and jumped. Rolled down a hill, been hiding ever since. Smart." Hank said, "You did good." Jake's eyes started to close. "Didn't think I mattered. You matter to me." Hank said, "You hear me? You matter." The sheriff reached them, radio already in hand. "We need medics at the canyon." "We found him," as the sound of sirens grew in the distance. Hank sat beside Jake, never letting go of his hand, and in that moment he knew. Something else to this wasn't just about saving a boy. It was about exposing everything that let someone like Kruger slip through the cracks. It was about showing people like Karen that kindness wasn't weakness. It was strength. The next day, Southridge Ranch was quiet. Hank stood at the hospital window looking out over the hills. Jake was asleep in the bed behind him, patched up and safe. The sheriff had confirmed it. Whoever Kruger was, she was part of something bigger. They'd found other IDs. Other kids listed as missing with no follow-up. An investigation was underway. Karen had gone silent. No more HOA memos. No more complaints. Just silence until the morning. A letter showed up at Hank's doorstep. It was from Karen, handwritten, and it said, "I was wrong about everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but thank you for reminding me what good people look like." Karen. Hank folded the letter and tucked it in his jacket, but just as he stepped out onto the porch, Bill came jogging up the drive. "Hank, you're going to want to hear this." Hank raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Bill held up a small envelope. "County zoning office. Just called. You're being sued." Hank blinked for what Bill grinned, holding up a paper with a bright red stamp across the top. "Illegally harboring livestock on non-residential land." Hank stared at him. "You're kidding, I wish," Bill said. "Guess who filed the paperwork?" Hank sighed. And in the distance, as if on cue, a familiar voice shrieked from the HOA clubhouse speaker system. "You can't let him get away with this." Hank stared at the paper like it was written in a different language. Bill stood next to him, still catching his breath, holding that ridiculous envelope with the red stamp like it was a winning lottery ticket, except this one came with a headache and a courtroom date. "She filed what now?" Hank asked. Dead serious. Bill scratched his head. "A lawsuit claims you're using non-residential land for livestock operations without proper zoning updates. Says the ranch is non-compliant with the new HOA buffer rules." Hank blinked slowly. The new rules were not even in the HOA. She convinced the county council to review land bordering HOA properties. Claims your cows are lowering property value. Hank looked down at the paper again, then up at the hills behind his ranch. His cows were out there right now, calm, peaceful, doing what cows do best, chewing grass and bothering absolutely no one. He looked back at Bill. "Is this a joke?" Bill shook his head. "She's not letting it go, I think, after what happened with Jake. She's trying to get back control of something, anything, by suing a ranch that's been here longer than this. Town's been paved. She's calling it a neighborhood emergency buffer zone initiative. She's got 3 HOA board members backing her." Hank rubbed a hand down his face. Just then, the sheriff's cruiser rolled up again. Hank let out a breath. "What now?" The sheriff stepped out, his face grim but calm. "Sorry to barge in again, Hank. Got 2 things you need to hear." "Let me guess," Hank said. "More bad news." The sheriff handed him a file folder. Not all of it. Hank opened it. Inside were printed photos, surveillance images, vehicle registration info, background checks. At the center of it all, Madison Kruger, or rather her real name. "Idantha Brandt," the sheriff said, "not a government agent. She was part of a child trafficking ring that uses fake credentials to pull kids out of the system." Jake was lucky, real lucky. Hank felt the air tighten around him. "She's been caught?" he asked. "Not yet," the sheriff replied, "but she's on the run. State and federal task forces are involved now. It's not just about Jake. There are others, dozens." Hank clenched his jaw. "What about the people who helped her?" "Karen gave her access. She's being investigated," the sheriff said. "But right. Her lawsuit's legit, twisted but legal, so she might not go down for what she did to Jake," Hank said. "Slowly, but she can still try to take my ranch." The sheriff nodded. She's dangerous when she feels powerless. She's using every tool she's got left. Hank looked back to Ward. The barn's still standing strong after all the repairs. Jake's hat was hanging on the post by the door where he'd left it before the canyon. Rusty lay beside it, tail flicking softly. Then she's about to find out, Hank said. What happens when you mess with the wrong cowboy? 2 days later, the courtroom in Burnt Valley County was packed. Reporters, neighbors, HOA board members, even Linda was there with a folding chair and a giant travel mug of tea. Karen walked in wearing a navy blue pantsuit, holding a massive binder flanked by 2 polished attorneys who looked like they'd never stepped on dirt in their lives. Across the aisle, Hank wore jeans, boots, and a clean white shirt. Nothing fancy, just Hank. Jake sat behind him, legs still in a brace but healing. The sheriff sat beside him. Rusty was outside, tied to a tree, howling. Anytime Karen so much as glanced toward the building, the judge entered. Case number, the bailiff read, Karen Bellamy and the Southridge Estates, HOA versus Hank Lawson, owner of Southridge Ranch. Karen stood all smiles. Your Honor, we're here today not to stir conflict but to preserve community standards. The defendant's property, while technically bordering our neighborhood, has directly impacted our quality of life, noise, animal waste, runoff, and safety issues. We have petitioned the court to restrict his livestock from occupying land within FT of our residential lots. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Lawson, your response? Hank stood up calm, solid as a tree. Your Honor, my ranch has been here since our land is properly zoned for agriculture. Our fences are legal. Our animals contained, and every inch of what we do is by the book. This isn't about cows. This is about a woman who lost a fight she started and is now trying to win a war that doesn't exist. Karen's lawyers objected to the personal attack. Hank didn't flinch. Continue, the judge said. Hank held up a USB drive. This contains the footage of Miss Bellamy trespassing on my land at night, dumping chemicals near my fence line, and collaborating with a known criminal who abducted a child from my property. Karen's jaw dropped. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. That video is under state review, her lawyer stammered. Hank turned to the judge. The sheriff has confirmed the identity of the suspect. This woman handed a child over to her without verifying credentials because she cared more about appearance than the boy's safety. Jake looked down at the floor. The judge looked at him gently. I also have statements, Hank said, pulling papers from a folder from 6 neighbors confirming she manipulated the HOA into changing zoning interpretations without informing non-member residents like myself. The judge tapped her pen. Miss Bellamy, she said, did you attempt to use legal zoning codes to push your neighbor's livestock operations out of range? Karen stood up slowly. I did what I thought was best for our neighborhood. And did you verify the credentials of the woman you brought to remove a minor from the premises? She had ID. She looked official. Did you check with CPS first? Karen paused. No, but enough. The judge said this court will recess for deliberation. She stood and left. Karen sat down slowly, blinking fast as if realizing for the first time how deep she'd sunk. The ruling came hours later. The judge returned to the bench. The courtroom fell silent. In reviewing all evidence and testimony, the court finds the following: the Southridge Ranch is in full compliance with county zoning laws. The petition to restrict livestock activity is hereby denied. Furthermore, due to the unverified facilitation of an illegal custody transfer, this court is referring Miss Bellamy and the Southridge Estates HOA board to the state attorney for investigation into potential endangerment and abuse of authority. Karen's mouth fell open. One of her lawyers sat back inside. The other just stared at the table. The judge turned to Hank. Mr. Lawson, your property and your character remain intact. Let me say personally, thank you for what you did for that boy. Hank tipped his hat. Just doing what's right, ma'am. The gavel slammed once the room erupted. Bill slapped Hank on the back. Linda wiped away tears. Rusty barked from outside like he knew. Jake stood up on his good leg. Nice, classy. You did it, he whispered. Hank turned to him. We did. Karen stood frozen as people walked past her, as the cameras flashed, as the reputation she'd built brick by manicured brick started to crumble around Her, and maybe just maybe she realized what it felt like to be powerless that night back at the ranch. The stars were out. Hank sat on the porch, coffee in one hand, old guitar in the other. Jake sat next to him, a little bruised, a little beat up, but more whole than ever before. Judge said I might get placed here, Jake said, eyes hopeful. Real placement. You okay with that, Hank asked. Jake nodded. More than okay. Rusty barked at a cricket and trotted off toward the barn. You ever think she'll come back? Jake asked. Hank thought about it maybe, but we'll be ready. You scared? Nope. Jake looked up at the stars. Why not? Hank smiled. Because fear don't live in a house where kindness built the walls. Jake smiled back. You should put that on a sign, Hank chuckled. Nah. Rather live it, and under the stars with the cows settling down in the fields, the porch light casting a warm glow across the wood, and the silence of peace finally setting in, Hank played the first notes of a song neither of them had heard before because it was theirs. Now a new beginning, a real home, and this time nobody was taking it away.